The town of Riverside Falls looked like any other quiet industrial community in the Pacific Northwest, with its rusted water towers, scattered diners serving bitter coffee, and streets that emptied out after sunset. But beneath the surface of ordinary life, something darker had taken root over the past 15 years, something that twisted through every business deal, every municipal decision, every whispered conversation in back rooms where smoke hung thick and deals were sealed with handshakes that meant more than contracts. Viktor Sokolov ran this town the way a puppeteer controls marionettes, invisible strings connecting him to the mayor, the police chief, the union bosses, and the judges who somehow always ruled in favor of his construction companies, his shipping operations, and his real estate holdings that swallowed entire neighborhoods. Victor was a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s with silver hair, slicked back from a face that had seen violence up close and had learned to deliver it with surgical precision. His suits were tailored in London, his watches Swiss, his accent carrying just enough of the old country to remind people that he came from places where power was taken, not given. He operated from a compound on the northern edge of town, a sprawling estate surrounded by iron gates and security cameras, where armed men in dark jackets patrolled the grounds with the casual menace of wolves guarding their territory. But Viktor Sokolov had one vulnerability, one crack in his otherwise impenetrable armor, and her name was Elena. She was 19, with her mother's delicate features and dark hair that fell in waves past her shoulders, and she moved through the world with the kind of innocence that seemed impossible for someone raised in the shadow of organized crime. Viktor had shielded her carefully, sending her to private schools where bodyguards posed as drivers, keeping her away from the men who came to the house late at night, telling her only that he was in construction and import-export, vague explanations that she accepted because she trusted her father completely. Elena spent her days studying art history at the community college, painting watercolors in the sunroom of their estate, and volunteering at the local animal shelter where she wore jeans with paint stains and played with rescue dogs who licked her face and made her laugh. She knew nothing of the shipments that arrived at the docks at 3 in the morning, nothing of the men who disappeared after crossing her father, nothing of the system of fear and control that kept Riverside Falls running like clockwork under Victor's iron will. On a Thursday afternoon in late September, as golden light filtered through the changing leaves and cast everything in amber tones, a convoy of motorcycles rolled into Riverside Falls with the distinctive rumble of Harley-Davidson engines that made windows rattle and heads turn. There were 8 of them, members of a Hells Angels chapter out of Montana, their leather cuts bearing patches and insignia that told stories of brotherhood, territory, and a code that existed outside the law, but held more weight among them than any statute book. They were headed to Oregon for a regional run, stopping in small towns along the way for gas, food, and cheap motels where they could sleep off the road exhaustion. The lead rider was a man they called Reaper, a lanky enforcer with a scarred face and a reputation for settling disputes with his fists. Behind him rode Tiny, who was anything but tiny, a 300-pound gentle giant who could bench press a motorcycle and loved classic country music. There was Spider, a former Marine with tattoos covering every visible inch of skin, and Mercy, the only woman in the group, a mechanic who could rebuild an engine blindfolded and had earned her patch through skills and loyalty that none of the men questioned. And then there was Cage. He rode near the back, a man in his mid-30s with dark stubble, deep-set eyes that carried the weight of things he'd seen and done, and a quietness that set him apart from the others. His real name was Thomas Cage, though no one had called him that in years, and he wore his cut with the same pride as the others, but with something else underneath, something that looked like regret or maybe just exhaustion. Cage had a story that the others knew only pieces of, fragments shared over beers in the early morning hours when defenses came down and truth slipped out between swigs. He'd been married once, to a woman named Sarah who worked as a nurse and had believed she could love away his demons. They'd had a daughter, a little girl with blonde curls and a gap-toothed smile, who called him Daddy and made him promise to always keep her safe. He'd been trying to go straight then, working construction, coming home tired but clean, telling himself he could leave the club life behind. But the past has claws, and one night a rival gang had come looking for him, wanting revenge for something Cage had done years before in a different chapter, a different life. They'd kicked in his door at 2 in the morning, and Cage had fought them in his kitchen while Sarah screamed for him to stop, to just let them take what they wanted. He'd killed 2 of them, broken a third man's skull with a cast-iron skillet, but in the chaos, in the violence that erupted like a storm inside his home, his daughter had come down the stairs clutching her stuffed rabbit. A wild shot, a panic trigger pull, and everything that mattered to Cage had ended in an instant. Sarah had left him after that, unable to even look at him without seeing what his life had cost them. Cage had gone back to the club, to the only family he had left, and he'd ridden ever since with a hole in his chest that never quite healed. The bikers pulled into a truck stop on the edge of Riverside Falls, parking their motorcycles in a neat row and stretching road-weary muscles. The afternoon was cooling into evening, the sky turning shades of purple and orange that painters try to capture but never quite get right. They moved into the diner attached to the truck stop, a fluorescent-lit space with cracked vinyl booths and a jukebox playing Willie Nelson, and they settled in with menus and that particular hunger that comes from hours on the road. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes and a practiced smile, brought them coffee and took their orders with the efficient detachment of someone who'd seen every type of customer pass through over the years. She didn't bat an eye at their patches, their tattoos, their road dust, and leather, just called them honey and asked if they wanted pie with that. Viktor Sokolov was 3 miles away at that exact moment, sitting in his office at the estate, reviewing shipping manifests on his laptop while classical music played softly from hidden speakers. His phone rang, the screen showing a number he recognized, one of his lieutenants calling with the kind of urgent tone that meant trouble. Viktor listened, his face betraying nothing, as the man explained that a shipment had been intercepted, that someone had talked, that the state police were asking questions about container numbers and warehouse addresses. This was the kind of problem Viktor had handled 100 times before, the kind that required quick thinking, strategic moves, and sometimes the permanent removal of loose ends. He ended the call and immediately made 3 more, setting events in motion with the calm efficiency of a chess master moving pieces across a board. What Viktor didn't know was that his enemies had been waiting for exactly this kind of distraction, for a moment when his attention was divided and his guard was down by even the smallest fraction. Elena was in town that afternoon, her car parked outside an art supply store, where she'd spent an hour selecting watercolor paper and new brushes, the kind of small pleasures that made her happy. She'd texted her father to let him know she'd be home late, that she was meeting a friend for coffee, and Viktor had responded with his usual stern reminder to keep her phone on and to let their driver know if she needed anything. But Elena had wanted independence, wanted to feel like a normal 19-year-old girl who could grab coffee without a security detail. So she'd slipped away from the bodyguard who usually shadowed her by telling him she was staying at the store longer than she actually did. She walked down Main Street as the sun began to set, her bag of art supplies swinging at her side, completely unaware that 3 men in a black sedan had been tracking her movements for the past 40 minutes, waiting for the right moment to strike. The bikers finished their meal as night settled over Riverside Falls, paying their bill and preparing to find a motel for the evening. Cage was the last one out, lingering over his coffee with that distant look in his eyes that meant he was somewhere else entirely, probably back in that kitchen, probably hearing his daughter's voice calling for him. Reaper slapped him on the shoulder, a gesture of brotherhood that said, "We're here, you're not alone," and Cage nodded, leaving bills on the table and following his brothers out into the parking lot where their bikes waited like faithful steel horses. They were mounting up, engines firing with that distinctive Harley growl, when the sound of screeching tires cut through the evening air. A black sedan came tearing around the corner 2 blocks down, moving with the kind of reckless speed that meant either a chase or an escape, and before anyone could process what they were seeing, gunfire erupted from the sedan's windows, muzzle flashes bright against the darkening sky. The target was a silver Mercedes that had just pulled up to the curb outside a coffee shop, and in the split second before chaos consumed everything, Cage saw a young woman with dark hair stepping out of that Mercedes, frozen in shock as bullets punched through metal and shattered glass. Time did what it always does in moments of violence, stretching and compressing simultaneously so that everything happened both in an instant and across an eternity. Elena Sokolov stood beside her car, her hand still on the door handle, her mind unable to process the reality of gunfire because gunfire wasn't something that happened in her world, wasn't something she'd been trained to recognize or react to. The first bullet hit her car's rear window, spider-webbing the glass into 1,000 fractured pieces that glittered like diamonds in the streetlight. The second bullet was aimed directly at her, a kill shot meant to send a message to Viktor Sokolov that no one was untouchable, that even his careful protection couldn't save what he loved most. But the bullet never reached her because Cage had already moved, his body acting on instincts carved deep by years of violence and loss, by the muscle memory of a man who'd failed to protect someone once and had carried that failure like a stone in his chest ever since. He came off his motorcycle with his boots hitting pavement hard, running with the kind of desperate speed that ignores physical limits, his brothers shouting behind him as they processed what was happening, as they reached for weapons and dove for cover. Cage covered the 30 feet between his bike and Elena in perhaps 3 seconds, perhaps 4, time becoming meaningless as his world narrowed to one singular purpose. He crashed into Elena like a linebacker, wrapping his arms around her and twisting his body so that his back was to the sedan, so that his leather cut and his flesh and his bones would be the barrier between this girl and the violence meant for her. They hit the ground hard, Cage's shoulder taking the impact, his arms cradling Elena's head, even as the bullet meant for her heart punched into his back, just below his right shoulder blade. The pain was instantaneous and overwhelming, white-hot and spreading like liquid fire through his torso. But Cage held on, covering Elena's body with his own as more shots rang out, and his brothers returned fire with the overwhelming response of men trained in violence and unafraid to use it. The next 10 seconds were pure chaos. Reaper put 3 rounds through the sedan's windshield while Spider circled wide with his .45 extended in a two-handed grip, advancing with the tactical precision of his Marine training. Tiny, despite his size, moved with surprising speed to flank the vehicle from the other side, while Mercy was already on her phone screaming for ambulance and police. The sedan's driver, realizing the attack had gone catastrophically wrong, slammed the accelerator and fishtailed away from the scene, leaving rubber on asphalt and the acrid smell of gunpowder hanging in the air. Reaper emptied his clip after them, blowing out the rear window, but missing the occupants, and then suddenly the street was quiet except for the ringing in everyone's ears and the sound of someone sobbing, which turned out to be Elena, who was pinned beneath Cage's weight and couldn't understand what had happened or why there was blood soaking through her shirt that wasn't her own. Cage tried to speak, tried to tell her it was okay, that she was safe now, but his words came out as a wet cough that tasted of copper, and his vision was starting to tunnel at the edges. He'd been shot before, twice actually, and he knew from experience that this was bad, that the bullet had probably hit something important based on how hard it was becoming to breathe. But there was also something else, something almost like peace in knowing that this time his presence had saved someone instead of getting them killed, that this girl was alive beneath him because he'd been in the right place at the right moment, because every mistake and failure that had led him to this parking lot in this forgotten town had somehow resulted in someone's daughter going home to her father tonight. He rolled off Elena with what little strength remained, his leather cut dark and slick with blood, and he looked up at the darkening sky where stars were beginning to emerge and thought about Sarah, about his daughter with her gap-toothed smile, about all the ways a life could go wrong and somehow still mean something in the end. Elena scrambled to her knees, her hands shaking, her face pale, and when she saw the blood spreading beneath the man who'd saved her, she let out a sound that was part scream and part prayer. She pressed her hands against his chest, trying to stop the bleeding the way she'd seen in movies, her art history classes having prepared her for absolutely nothing that was happening right now. Mercy was beside her a moment later, gently moving Elena's hand aside and applying pressure with the competence of someone who'd done battlefield triage more times than she cared to remember. Cage's eyes found Elena's face, focused on her features with the kind of intensity that comes when you know you might not have many moments left, and he tried to smile, even though it came out as more of a grimace. "You're okay," he whispered, blood on his teeth. "You're safe now." The police arrived first, 3 patrol cars with sirens wailing, and officers emerged with weapons drawn until they pieced together what had happened, until witnesses from the coffee shop started pointing and explaining. The ambulance came 2 minutes later, paramedics rushing with practiced efficiency, getting Cage loaded onto a stretcher while one of them cut away his shirt and vest to expose the entry wound. They worked quickly, establishing in 4-line and calling ahead to the hospital with information shouted in medical shorthand that meant nothing to anyone listening but everything to the surgeons who would soon be fighting to save Cage's life. Elena tried to follow the stretcher, still covered in his blood, still shaking with adrenaline and shock, but a female officer held her gently, asking her name, asking who to call, until Elena whispered, "My father," and gave them Viktor Sokolov's number. Viktor arrived at the scene like a hurricane, his convoy of black SUVs descending on the street with enough armed men to start a small war. He moved through the police line with the authority of someone who owned the town, which essentially he did, and when he saw Elena standing there covered in blood, his face went through a series of emotions that few people ever witnessed: fear and rage and relief, all compressed into 3 seconds of human vulnerability before his mask slammed back into place. He gathered his daughter into his arms, holding her while she sobbed into his shoulder, and over her head his eyes scanned the scene with the cold assessment of a predator calculating revenge. One of his men approached and whispered details into his ear, details about the sedan, about the shooters, about how this was clearly a hit meant for Elena, and how it had only failed because of the bikers, because of the one biker in particular who was now being rushed to surgery with a bullet in his lung. The bikers gave their statements to police with the careful precision of men who'd dealt with law enforcement many times before, saying just enough to be helpful, but not so much that anything could be used against them later. They refused to leave until they knew Cage's condition, camping out in the hospital waiting room, despite the hostile looks from security and nurses who weren't thrilled about having a Hell's Angels chapter occupy their territory. Reaper paced like a caged animal, his hands flexing and unflexing, while Spider sat stone-faced and Tiny quietly cried tears that ran down his broad cheeks unchecked. Mercy made phone calls back to their chapter, letting them know what had happened, arranging for more brothers to come if needed, because when one of their own went down, the rest rallied like an army. Viktor Sokolov arrived at the hospital an hour later with Elena, who'd been checked by paramedics and found physically unharmed. She'd changed clothes, but her hair still smelled of gunpowder, and her eyes had that 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd seen the moment of their own death approach and then inexplicably turn away. Viktor approached the bikers with his security detail flanking him, and for a long moment, the two groups simply regarded each other, outlaws and organized crime, two different breeds of men who lived outside society's rules in their own distinct ways. Reaper stepped forward, his scarred face set in hard lines, prepared for confrontation, but Viktor simply extended his hand and said in his accented English, "Your brother saved my daughter's life. I am in his debt, and in yours." The surgery lasted 4 hours, a team of doctors working to remove the bullet, repair the damage to Cage's lung, and stabilize him enough that he might actually survive. When the surgeon finally emerged, he looked exhausted, but cautiously optimistic, explaining that the next 24 hours would be critical, but that the patient had a fighting chance. They let them see him one at a time, and when it was Reaper's turn, he stood beside Cage's bed looking at his brother hooked up to machines and tubes, his face pale against white sheets, and he gripped Cage's hand gently and told him he was the toughest son of a bitch he'd ever known, and he better not die because they still had miles to ride together. Elena asked if she could see him, and after a moment's consideration, the nurses allowed it. This girl who'd been a stranger to him hours ago, but whose life was now permanently intertwined with his in ways that would take years to fully understand. She stood beside his bed with her hands clasped in front of her like she was in church, looking at the man who'd thrown himself between her and bullets without hesitation, without knowing her name or whether she deserved such a sacrifice. His eyes fluttered open for a moment, drug-heavy and unfocused, but they found her face, and something like recognition passed across his features. Elena leaned closer, her voice barely a whisper, and said, "Thank you," with such raw emotion that it carried the weight of every prayer she'd ever spoken. Cage's lips moved, forming words too quiet to hear. But she thought she understood them anyway. "Stay safe," he was saying, or maybe it's okay, or maybe just her name that he'd heard someone speak. But Elena knew what she'd heard in that parking lot, knew the last words he'd said before the ambulance had taken him. And she would carry them with her for the rest of her life like a talisman, like a promise that even in the darkest moments, even when violence comes looking with a loaded gun, there are still people who will throw themselves in front of bullets for strangers, who will sacrifice everything for someone they don't even know, who will prove that honor and courage aren't dead but just harder to find these days. Victor stood in the hallway making phone calls with a voice cold enough to freeze blood. And across town men were already moving, hunting the shooters who dared to target his daughter, preparing retribution that would be swift and absolute. But for now, in this hospital room lit by machines that beeped steadily and monitored the rhythm of a biker's healing heart, Elena Sokolov sat beside Thomas Cage and held his hand gently while her father's world prepared for war, and the Hell's Angels waited to see if their brother would ride again. And outside, the autumn night deepened over Riverside Falls, where nothing would ever quite be the same again, because unlikely heroes had proven that redemption sometimes comes wrapped in leather and riding on two wheels, and the debt created by a bullet taken for a stranger was the kind that could never be fully repaid, but would forge bonds stronger than blood between people who should have remained worlds apart.